Today we're going to talk about the best hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh! In March 2025. How's it going everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're doing a tier list for the best hand traps in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! For March 2025. The current best decks in the format are strategies like Malice, Blue Eyes Primite, Rizal variants, and any deck really playing the Fiendsmith engine. These are the decks that most people are going to be focusing on for this competitive season, so we want to make sure we have the best hand traps to counter those strategies. As always, when I do my tier list, I have 6 categories to talk about. The first one is going to be playable in most main decks. We also have playable in some main decks, playable in most side decks, and in some side decks. We also have niche and just don't. Just don't means just don't play it, and niche would be hand traps that have very limited application, but should still see some play from time to time. Now I have just about 30 hand traps to talk about in this video, so make sure to smash the like button if you're excited, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and comment down below what hand traps you're playing in your decks. Starting off in alphabetical order, we have none other than Ally of Justice Cycle Reader. This card is really interesting. It's a card that can put in a lot of pressure against a lot of the light decks that are running around in the format. Pretty much any deck that's playing the Fiendsmith engine or the Blue Eyes cards are going to hate dealing with Ally of Justice Cycle Reader. It basically is a discard from hand to be a double Bystial that doesn't give you a body, which is perfectly fine because it doesn't play into Triple Tactic Thrust. However, the card is doing nothing against pretty much any other strategy in the game right now. I mean, sure, Rizal, it can have some impact, but it's not going to be that significant. So for that reason, I would put Ally of Justice Cycle Reader in the niche tier. Up next is Artifact Lancea, which has been seeing a ton of play over the past couple of weeks, pretty much ever since Malice became part of the format. The card essentially turns off that entire deck, but can also shut down a few other strategies as well. It's a card that is basically one of those floodgate type hand traps like Dimension Shifter or Droll, and a lot of people are calling for it to be banned or limited on the next list. However, I would disagree. I think it's a necessary evil to put decks like Malice in check. That being said, the card is very powerful, but should not see any play in the main deck unless you're under very specific circumstances. Like, for example, I played in White Forest because it also counts as a spell card by sending it to the field, but not every deck can take advantage of it that way. And for that reason, I would put Artifact Lancea in the playable in most side decks tier. Ash Blossom is still the most flexible hand trap in the entire game. It can be used offensively on your turn to stop cards like Mulcharmy Fuwalos, Purelia, and Meowls, which is going to be amazing for your ability to set up a board. It's also really good to stop opposing interruption. For example, you can stop MTPO7's ability to search, which shuts down their ability to banish. You can also make Wishes a 1-for-2, which is going to be amazing for your ability to win that game. And on top of that, you can negate Duo Drive's effect to search for 2 cards, or even the effect of Mitsurugi Ritual to summon from the deck. And it's still so good against pretty much every single rogue deck out there because it negates all these really common effects like summoning from the deck, sending to graveyard, or adding to hand. Ash Blossom will be our first card in the playable in most main decks tier. Moving on to the Bystials, specifically Magnuma, Drewsworm, Baldrake, pretty much all of them are going to be blanketed in this one category. These Bystials are insane in this format. Think about it, all the decks in this format right now have pretty much light or dark monsters, so they're always going to be online. The main thing is that if you banish a Malice monster, it can come back, which does hurt a bit, and Malice is playing Bystials to extent. But it's so good against Blue Eyes. By banishing both the Blue Eyes White Dragons from their graveyard, it shuts off a lot of what Blue Eyes can do in the long run. And it's also great against the Fiendsmith engine because you can banish their copy of Requiem to stop them from accessing monsters from the deck. And they're also pretty good against Rizal, specifically against Rizal Cross, because if they target a light monster, you can banish it to stop them from getting the draw. I think Bystials are some of the best hand traps in the game. They not only provide you with an extra body, but additional benefits to boot as well. Drewsworm sends cards to the graveyard, Magma searches for another dragon, and Baldrake can basically banish any extra deck summon. And for those reasons, I would have the Bystials as playable in some main decks. Chaos Hunter is up next, and I've been talking shit about this card for pretty much the entirety of the time I've been doing these videos, but not anymore. Chaos Hunter is so incredibly important because Malice is running around and really relies heavily on banishing cards. Additionally, one of their main outs to Chaos Hunter when they're going first is going to be to use something like SP Little Knight, which they can't even use to banish the Chaos Hunter. It is a pretty heavy investment, but if you can manage to get Chaos Hunter online, it can shut down a lot of what Malice can do. Is it as good as Artifact Lancea? I don't really think so, but it still does see play in a lot of strategies, and for that reason, I would put it as playable in some side decks. Contact C is incredibly bad right now. There's almost no situation where I would recommend playing this card. Almost every deck has a Link monster they can just summon out using this card anyways to get it off the field, and then just continue with their plays normally. For example, even a deck like Ryzel can just summon out Haggard Lizardos to basically banish itself and be able to still resolve their effects of X to search for cards and be able to extend fully. The impact of this card is so incredibly limited that I would just not recommend playing it at all. So for that reason, it falls in the just don't tier. DD Crow had a lot of utility back in the Fire format, but has really fallen out of grace right now. Now that might seem a little bit strange because it's essentially just another Bystial because you just banish a light monster from the graveyard. However, you don't end up with the big body of 2500 attack, you don't get the extra benefits as well, and yes, it can target anything, it's just not going to be as strong in my opinion. If you're going to be playing cards that interact with the graveyard, just play the Bystial monsters instead. And I get that Druid's Worm is expensive, but you can always play Saronir and Baldrake instead. And if you really want to focus on light-based strategies like Blue Eyes, you're better off just playing Ally of Justice Psycho Reader, so for that reason, just don't play DD Crow. Dimension Shifter is still one of the most toxic Yu-Gi-Oh cards in the game, and I honestly hope it gets banned on the upcoming ban list, but I don't really think that's going to happen. That being said, it's a card that is seeing a decent amount of play, specifically in a deck like Malice. Now, they don't really want to play Shifter that often because the card itself can be a little bit conflicting with their own combo, but it still is a great choice at slowing the game down and forcing the opponent into a tough spot. It absolutely destroys decks like Blue Eyes, for example, and the Fiendsmith strategies, so you want to have it at least in the side deck if you're playing Malice in my opinion, but some decks are even playing it in the main. So for that reason, I would put it as playable in some main decks. Dominus Impulse is up next, and this card is also a great new hand trap that we got introduced to back in, I think it was Rage of the Abyss. The card is really good at shutting down any card that would special summon and can destroy those cards as well, which has a lot of utility. However, you're limited to what decks can actually use it, so automatically there you know it's not going to be playable in most main decks, especially because one of the attributes that really doesn't work with this card is going to be light attributes. So for that reason, because light attribute cards are super popular in this format, I would only put Dominus Impulse as playable in some main decks. Dominus Purge isn't as good as Impulse, but it still is a really solid card that will see a good amount of play in this format, mostly because the best attributes that interact with this card are going to be Light, Wind, and Earth. And if you look closely at the Blue Eyes decks, Blue Eyes is playing a ton of light monsters with the Primal Dragon Ether Barrels, which are going to be Earth monsters. And because that deck is so popular, I wouldn't be surprised to see a ton of people playing Dominus Purge. But because half the attributes in the entire game can't even play it and it's not as good as Dominus Impulse, I would only put it as playable in some main decks. Droll and Lockbird is another amazing Yu-Gi-Oh card that I think is a necessary evil. And I hate that I have to say that because every deck I play always loses to Droll for some reason. It's great against the Blue Eyes strategies because they're constantly adding from deck to hand. It's really solid against Ryzel Mitsurugi, and against some variants of Pure Ryzel, it can actually be really good as well. Same thing with Fiendsmith, depending on their starter. It does really nothing against Malice decks because they can play kind of right through it, but that's fine. The card is still really good and can shut down a lot of different decks, including a lot of rogue strategies. And while it's not the perfect card, there are some decks that are playing it in the main. But for me, I would recommend playing it more so in the side deck for when the matchup is actually warranted. So for that reason, I would put Droll and Lockbird as playable in most side decks. Effect Veiler is just standard effect negation, and it really sucks that you can't use it outside of your opponent's main phase, but it still is a really good card because effect negation is always going to be strong. It also sucks that you can't use it under Dimension Shifter because you have to send the card to graveyard for cost, but that doesn't stop the card from seeing a lot of competitive play. Blue Eyes is playing 3 copies of Effect Veiler because they can search it with a card like Wishes or Sage, and the fact that it's not once per turn means they can have a lot of extra interruption on their opponent's turn. But Blue Eyes isn't the only deck that's playing it. There are so many decks that have a ton of room for non-engine, and Effect Veiler just happens to be one of the better options in the format, especially if you're on a budget. It's not the best effect negation out there, but it still is a really solid choice nonetheless. In my opinion, Effect Veiler belongs as playable in some main decks. After I finish talking about Effect Veiler, I always move on to Infinite Impermanence because they're so similar, but Imperm is just drastically better than this card. It doesn't lose to a card like Call by the Grave, and it can be activated as a board breaker or as a hand trap, and additionally, it's a card that can be used under Dimension Shifter. In my opinion, Imperm is the second most flexible hand trap in the game after Ash Blossom. If you use it on Ryzel Detonator, they're forced to pop itself to bring it back with Eclipse Twins, which reduces the amount of interruptions they have from 5 down to 2. It's also great against the Malice end board because you can use it on something like Nightmare Griffin to shut off the Floodgate effect. It's really good against Blue Eyes to shut down Spirit Dragon, or even shut down their ability to get to Spirit, to get to Mausoleum, or even shut down Sage as well. And it's also really solid against something like a DDD Wave High King Caesar, or even a Fiendsmith Sequence as they try to fusion summon. The card is so flexible and has a really high ceiling that I would recommend that every deck should have it in their main deck. So obviously it is playable in most main decks. Up next is Fantastical Dragon Phantazmay, and I have a lot of respect for this card. The fact that in this format right now, almost every deck is using link monsters to summon out is really important because you can get targeting protection from the Phantazmay, but also cycle your hand, which is really good. The only concern is that it doesn't really interrupt the opponent, which can be a bit of a problem. So it's not going to be as impactful as a going second tool, more so as a tool to get you to other better going second cards. If it actually interrupted the opponent as well, it would definitely be higher, but for now I put it as playable in some side decks. I like Ghost Belle a lot. It's one of my favorite of the Ghost Sisters, but the card is really lackluster in this format. Sure, there's ways that you can interrupt cards like True Light, for example, or shut down Rizal Cross, but the card isn't that impactful because it doesn't remove the threat from your opponent's field or graveyard. And sure, it can interact with cards in the damage step, and it can be a really annoying piece of interruption because it can shut down things like Bystials, but the card itself just doesn't do enough on its own. If you really want to interrupt the graveyard this format, I highly recommend playing the Bystials instead. I hate to say this, but just don't play Ghost Belle. Ghost Mourner is very similar to Effect Veiler and Infinite Impermanence, but also completely different. The fact that it has to be used on the summon of the monster is what makes the card so bad in my opinion. You can use it on your turn, which is great, but if your opponent doesn't have an effect that activates on summon, then it doesn't really make a difference. If you really want to play Ghost Mourner, fine, I just really don't recommend it because there are so many other better hand traps in the game right now. So in my opinion, because there are so many other better options, I would put it in the just don't tier. Ghost Ogre is really good against one or two of the cards in pretty much every single strategy right now. It's amazing against True Light because you can blow up their entire field and prevent it from resolving. On top of that, it's really good against something like Rizal Duo Drive, assuming they don't have another Rizal Xyz monster on their side of the field. It's able to get rid of the Malice monster on the field, so they have nothing to banish, which can be really nice. However, I'm torn on this. I wouldn't put it in the main deck tiers, and I do believe it has some implication in the side deck. I definitely would put it there, but I don't know if I want it to be playable in most side decks or playable in some side decks. So what I'm going to do is, for now, I'm going to put it at the top of the playable in some side decks tier. And if you disagree with me, let me know why down in the comments below. It is a great card and I have no problem with it being a bit higher, but not much higher than that. Ghost Reaper is solid because there are so many strategies in the game right now that rely on a few key extra deck cards. For example, Rizal relies heavily on Rizal Detonator, and a lot of decks are playing a single copy of Detonator in their extra deck for MattOshea, so you might as well play Ghost Reaper as well to get rid of it so your opponent has no way of accessing it for the rest of the duel. If you manage to get rid of White Binder from a Malice player, you're going to be in a good position, and the same goes for the Link 1 in Blue Eyes. But it's just so hyper specific that I don't really recommend it for most players, so for that reason I put it in the niche tier. Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood was seeing a lot more play a few months ago as a way to win in time. However, it's not really the case right now because turns just aren't as long, combos aren't as in-depth, they're a bit more short and sweet with really high impact 1 or 2 card combos. So Ghost Sister is just not as impactful right now and isn't going to see a lot of play, so for that reason, just don't play it. Gnomaterial is bad. Do not play this card, it belongs in the just don't tier. Mulcharmy Fuwalos is the best of the Mulcharmies right now. The fact that so many strategies rely heavily on their extra deck and summoning from their deck is really the reason why. It shuts down so many different strategies and forces them to give you a ton of card advantage or end on a subpar board. And I know it's a really expensive card right now, but it is getting reprinted soon, and when it does, everyone should pick up a playset. The card is that important and can really allow you to steal games you otherwise wouldn't have won. In my opinion, if you have Mulcharmy Fuwalos, you should be playing it in your main deck. The card is that incredible. So for that reason, it is playable in most main decks. Mulcharmy Purelia is also a really good card, but it's not as good as Fuwalos. The card is able to draw you a card every time a monster is summoned from the hand, which is really nice. However, most decks are summoning once, twice, maybe 3 times from the hand tops, which is not going to be as good as Fuwalos because they can summon theoretically as many times as they want from deck or extra deck. In my opinion, Purelia has a better matchup against more decks in the game right now than Mulcharmy Meowls does, but it's not as high impact. It's not a card that I would really consider main decking right now because if you're going to main a Mulcharmy, it should be Mulcharmy Fuwalos. And unless you have room for like 22 hand traps, I don't think it really makes sense to play both of them in the main deck right now because you want to have other hand traps that are a bit more impactful. I would rather have hand traps that stop my opponent like Imperm or Ash Blossom rather than cards that would just make my opponent think about stopping. It's still a good card though, and I would definitely consider playing it in the side deck, and for that reason it's playable in most side decks. Mulcharmy Meowls is the newest Mulcharmy monster, and the card has a lot of value, specifically against a deck like Malice. Other than that though, the card isn't that good. It doesn't really beat a lot of the other strategies in the game today. I mean, it can have some impact on Fiendsmith decks, but that's really it. But Artifact Lancea is just a better card against Malice than Mulcharmy Meowls is, but if you want more hate against that strategy, definitely consider it. I do think that for its application against Malice, and considering Malice is going to be a really good deck this format, that you should play it in most side decks. Nibiru is a card that's going to see a ton of play in this format because there are a lot of different decks that just lose to Nib and pass on a Nib token. Pretty much all of the top 4 or 5 decks in the format all have combos that just lose to Nibiru and force them to end on a Nib token. Even a deck like Blue Eyes has pretty much no way to play around Nibiru unless they just make an early copy of Seals, and even then it's not that strong. And Nib is still so good when you pair it with other hand traps like Imperm, like Valor, like Ash Blossom. So for that reason, I would say Nibiru belongs as playable in most main decks. Moving on, we're going to talk about PSY-Framegear Gamma and PSY-Framegear Delta. I would put these cards into one category because you're not going to play Gamma with one singular brick in the deck. You're going to want to have other ways to take advantage of the driver. And right now, Gamma and Delta are both solid cards. They have some impact, but really you want to have the right deck to play them. And unfortunately, right now, I think those decks are really few and far between. So as powerful as the cards can be, I don't think they're going to be that playable. So I would put them in the niche tier. Retaliating C was a lot better back in Snake Eye format because there were a ton of spells that summoned out monsters, but that's not really the case right now. Just think about the top decks in the format. They don't really use any spell cards to actually get monsters onto the field. But if it does hit the field, it can be very powerful, banishing pretty much everything. However, I just don't think it's going to happen, so I would put it in the just don't tier. And finally, we have our last card being Sauravis, the Ancient and Ascended. This card is really only good in one deck, and that's going to be Voiceless Voice because it's essentially a searchable card. That being said, if you're worried about targeting effects, then sure, fine, you can play Sauravis, but honestly, I just don't recommend it. It's not impactful enough, not consistent enough, and just not good enough. So unless you're playing exactly Voiceless Voice, just don't play Sauravis. And there you have it. This is my tier list for the best hand traps in the March 2025 competitive Yu-Gi-Oh format. Now let me know what you guys think about the tier list down in the comments below, and I urge you to take a look at the title of the tiers. Because yes, a card like Artifact Lancea is amazing this format, it's so good, but it's a side deck card at best right now because it's going to do nothing against strategies that don't banish. Don't forget to let me know in the comments which hand traps you're currently playing in your decks, leave a like on the video if you haven't already, and subscribe to the channel for more. I also want to thank you all so much because today is officially 2 years of activity on this channel. The channel was made 2 years ago today, which is crazy to think about, and it's just flown by so fast. So thank you all so much for the ride, and thank you for watching the videos as always. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.